I'm Kandis, and I run Cassandra Press. So today I'm going to kind of tell you guys about the press in pieces. I'm going to introduce Cassandra, who she was in Greek mythology, and then I'm going to talk about collage, sort of the problems of being seen and seeing in pieces. It's going to be kind of a fever dream of random things. Then I'll talk about my reader series in particular, highlight a few readers and show you guys some. Then I'll talk about sort of like this idea of extraction, redistribution, and sort of like messy engagements with capitalist spaces. And then I will pitch some solutions. And then I'll talk to you guys about the Alexandria Library. So, Cassandra. Who is Cassandra? Cassandra was a figure in Greek mythology who was the daughter of King Priam and Queen Hecuba of Troy. She was a priestess in the Temple of Apollo. And there's two different versions of the story. Maybe another one, Ovid, is the most kind to her. But apparently she was a priestess for Apollo, which meant that she was chaste, so she had to maintain chastity her entire life. Apollo fell in love with her and asked her basically to sleep with him, and she denied him because she worshipped him. So interestingly enough, he rapes her, spits in her mouth, and gives her the gift of prophecy. So this is like kind of a hardcore version. In the more hardcore version, she accepts his offer to sleep with him and then kind of reneges once she gets the gift of prophecy, and then he curses her with deniability. So either way you slice it, Cassandra's kind of fucked. You know, she basically lives this chaste life. She becomes this powerful prophetess, and then she's cursed with deniability. So Apollo can't take her divine power away from her, and so he negates it by basically stopping her from being believed. And this is like kind of her fate. Interestingly enough, Cassandra has a twin brother named Helenus, who she also teaches the gift of prophecy, who is believed, to further add insult to injury. Cassandra is one of the only people in Greek mythology who, or in this kind of narrative of Greek mythology, who foresees the fall of Troy. So interestingly enough, I like to relate her to a sort of like divine intervener or potential space of like potential intervention on the birth of a nation state or the fall of a nation state. And so we looked at Cassandra a little bit to talk about bitterness, divination, deniability, and for me personally, she takes on this extra intense kind of mythic and symbolic character of the denied, the refused, the unbelieved, and kind of positions herself in relation to the fall of Troy in that way. So this is why we sort of like take the press, why my press has her name. I started the press with two friends, Jordan Nessar and Taylor Doran. Is my voice, is this okay? Am I talking loud enough? Okay. So I started this press with Taylor and Jordan. Taylor is studying Greek mythology and ancient Greek philosophy at Riverside, UC Riverside in California. Jordan and I met in Berlin 10 years ago in the art scene, and he's a very affluent artist. He's very successful in this moment, and I'm really proud of him. And so we have like this kind of Hydra head approach to the press, where I come from a very punk background, kind of grew up in squats, really used to Xerox in my own work and my own collage work, and this kind of like have been over the last 10 years watching Xerox fade nostalgically, or fade into like a sort of nostalgia from its former urgent self. I relate that also to Cassandra somehow, this sort of force that it used to have as a kid, making zines and flyers and getting punk shows out on walls and stuff. And now this sort of like antiquated look of it has a feeling of a charge of memory somehow, which is why I'm really drawn to the actual format of the publications. So I'll leave the intro to Cassandra with a quote by Sylvia Wynter, which is that we must now undertake a rewriting of history as we know it. So I'll start with this idea of collage and the problems of seeing in pieces, and just sort of biographically state that I came back to the States in 2016 after living abroad for about 12 years. Upon my return in March 2016, lo and behold, it was more fucked than ever. the America and the American condition. So I'll just kind of like go through, I literally called this section Problems. So the first thing is that in my practice, I was like sort of trying to liquidate a lot of the photographic content of images, fucking around or playing around with what the image is, what the content of the image is and how the image was produced, and then sort of trying to escape those associations or meanings, get to the base or the bottom of a kind of like production, a truth of production. This was all very naive and I was very young. But when I returned to Berlin, it was really interesting that like, returned from Berlin to the States, that idea of truth that I feel like art is sort of carrying, this idea of like how the truth can become made visible. I'd done a lot of thinking about that over like 10 years because I had the space and time to do so. And what I came back with was this sort of like strange, a really strange idea, or not idea, but a concept of the perceptual tools that modernity's left us with. In trying to liquidate photographic content and get to some truth, I realized that this untruth is all that exists in terms of like the convoluted paradoxes between artistic production, nationalist intention, content, and the list goes on. So thinking about sort of modernity and the perceptual tools that modernity's left us with, the sort of Marxist reification, mystification, naturalization, but then also the commodification and propaganda, thinking about Bauhaus and like Johannes Itten, thinking about also painting as a flattened space where a lot of the indigenous pre-colonial cultures that were sort of mined during colonial, like the first wave of colonialization from Europe, used ceramics, indigenous ritual, indigenous fetish, sculptures, textiles, architecture, and sculpture, and sort of flattened it into two-dimensional painting space. Think Picasso's Demoiselles d'Avignon, think Johannes Itten's Interactions of Color, where the entire first chapter is basically him sort of ranting about the force of the artist, the forces that artists control, pattern, rhythm, speed, light, color, and how they come from all over the, like a sort of mining of this force from all over the world, looking at the mandalas of Tibet, looking at the jade work of China and Japan, looking at, you know, the fetish sculptures of Africa and really like condensing them into a painting language. And then also kind of like imbuing the artist with this cultural force. Saying that the artist is almost like, I mean, this is like a Brunelleschi thing, that the architect is every man, but the Itten thing is that the artist controls all the forces of the visual, right? So there's this kind of like also post-colonial, very white Western European idea of the force of the visual and how that force becomes wrapped up in the individual identity of the artist as a purveyor of truth, as a surveyor of truth, as a designer of space, of naturalization, of a natural space, or this kind of, I don't even know if it's natural actually. If you look at like pictures of Picasso's studio, Klimt's studio, I mean the kind of like 2019 eye can see a very hectic hoarding of other cultural artifacts, a very like intent and intentional appropriation of the force of other cultures' visual strategies. So yeah, all these things sort of get naturalized into a painting language. That's one thing. And then in that painting space, truth becomes seen only through abstraction. Again, not in an indigenous form, you know? Again, this flattened sense of abstraction. Think the color field paintings that come out of Motherwell, or Albers to Motherwell. Klee's idea of the dot that moves turns into our cursor. Spinning, what are they called? Activity indicators, you know? So yeah, so this sort of legacy of modernity that comes back into the internet as well, and some sort of like functions, key functions that we recognize, like, yeah, basic sort of control over natural parts of the world are then condensed into signage through design, which is fucked up. I'm also going to mention that living in Germany for a while allowed me to learn German and also to do a lot of research on Hitler's idea of this Führer museum. So another sort of like modernist approach or coming out of a kind of like end of World War II modernity is this idea of Hitler designed basically a museum that was where he would house all of the stolen artworks from all over Europe. the Führer Museum. And it was this huge, grand plan to steal all the major artworks of Europe and then start this like sort of bountiful German, I don't even know, like art. Yeah, I mean, I really think he definitely compared it to Alexandria. So go for what that is, you know. We know Hitler, he was crazy. But this idea of national wealth, and that national wealth can also be visible in terms of the collection of an art collection. The redistribution of especially Jewish collections after World War II that were going to go into the Führer Museum ended up starting a lot of our national collections. MoMA has the Goodman collection, I believe. You can all fact check me on this and it might not be right, but I think MoMA has the Goodman collection. A few museums in Texas have also a few Austrian collections, all like sort of recuperated from Jewish families and then sort of, I guess, in a weird way, stashed in American currency or American evaluations of it. And this kind of changes our museum structures a lot, like drastically after World War II, in ways that I'll get to soon. Next part is this sort of fever dream. I'm gonna skip really strangely, I guess, onto coming back to the States. But one of the things that shocked me coming back was this sort of access to the black body as a spectacle via hypersexualization, this sort of survivor syndrome, death images, extreme fetishism, and seeing that that hadn't really changed since I was living in the States, since I left the States, and that it was actually more exacerbated by current social media and media technologies, was really challenging. Understanding kind of like also that as a history of, and like as an aesthetic tradition, essentially, that while sort of starting off, or not starting off, but as a Gründung, as an in basis, white supremacist and degrading, also storing caches, huge caches outside of the black religious experience for the redistribution of civil rights campaigns in a private grassroots level. I'll say that really plainly. The minstrel is actually also the underground funder of a lot of civil rights campaigns, you know? So this sort of like image of the black fool, this image of the athlete, of the video hoe, of the welfare mom, you know, all of these sort of like celebrity degrading death images, these death masks of the black identity, are also extracting a lot of capital from the system that degrades. So again, with this aesthetic notion of like where we are, where we can be, how we're seen, what's not seen, and being away for a while, like coming back to a more hysterical, sort of problematic vision of blackness via all the sort of fractured prism-like engagements in social media. So I think there's a way where black bodies are starting, like black people sort of are starting to see themselves captured, this sort of woke movement. Woke is often also very irritating for me as a term. I've heard a lot of people consider piracy here, like sort of skeptically. I don't really care. I think it's a cool word. I mean, the history of it is interesting, but like, yeah, this idea of woke is really troublesome in so many ways. I mean, it's not healthy. I saw a baby with a t-shirt that said "Stay woke" on it. You don't want a baby to stay woke, you know? Sleep, like chill. But then this thing of like the lack of sleep, you know what I mean? In Hypnos, in the cave of Hypnos, Hypnos and his brother Thanatos are twins, sleep and death. So when you go to sleep at night, you see death's face. So it's a practice, you know? Sleep is a practice for a peaceful death. Staying woke, in my mind, is doing something very tricky to the spectacle of the black body and the maintenance that the black body has to hold against this sort of extreme aesthetic paradox, you know? This paradox of the self. So I'll go right into the next point, which is the point that W.E.B. Du Bois brings up with his sort of theories of the double consciousness in 1913. So this is, W.E.B. Du Bois is an amazing, a monastic scholar from the turn of the century. He's writing from almost the end of slavery until the 1920s, 30s, 40s. He's starting schools, hospitals. He's doing some of the only statistic work on the freedmen, the post-emancipation sort of freedmen. He starts an organization called the Freedmen's Bureau, which inevitably fails and is subverted by another movement called the Planners Movement, which is a movement of the white industrialists, former slave-owning South, which kind of, this network of very wealthy white industrialists end up like turning, or basically creating the prototypes for Jim Crow, recriminalizing the black body after the 13th Amendment is passed. And because they had such a strong manufacturing and industrial claim in the United States, every state had to reintegrate, had to apply to enter the Union. All the southern states had to reapply to the Union separately. I don't know if it's well known, I don't think it is. But they got to negotiate their terms, essentially, for a readmission. And so we see a lot of like the extreme policing of the black body and a criminalization of blackness starting there. And in this way where it's a very interesting sort of dissonant law building. It's a law building that's colorblind, essentially. The 13th Amendment is really funny, you know, it says nobody can be held against their will, but then it also says, unless you do something wrong, then we got you. And then we get to like the 15th Amendment that says we can't make any more laws colored, you know, like, so there's no reparative measure then able to be taken for the reconstruction of like the communities or the building actually of an infrastructure, not even the reconstruction, the building of an infrastructure for the freedmen. So you have millions of people like released from slavery in Texas actually 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation is passed because the Texan plantation owners did not tell their slaves they were free. The Union Army comes through and tells them. Actually, yesterday was Juneteenth. Happy Juneteenth, y'all. So this sort of like Du Bois is tapping into a lot of these and actually sort of doing the work of archiving a lot of these political strategies of the Planners Movement, while also sort of doing a lot of ethnographic work within the population of freedmen, going from state to state, house to house, even interviewing people, asking them what their lives are like, how much money they earn, if they have a house, if they'll buy a house, if they can. And really also turning a lot of that into really beautiful prose. I recommend an essay that he wrote on death and beauty, or beauty and death. I'll skip back down to that. Around this time as well as the first recordings of Negro spirituals. Again, back to this sort of aesthetic paradox around the black body. The Negro spiritual recordings, made more often than not by slave-owning people, were some of the most popular forms of American music. The first popular forms of American music, widely distributed, widely heard, widely re-sang, widely remixed, you know. And this idea of soul, you know, this capturing of soul. This sort of, Du Bois also has a really great essay called Of the Sorrow Songs. So he talks about the access that the white soul can have to this black struggle and the importance of like pushing this, using this sort of mechanism, using this aesthetic space in order to like reach out and reach into the white soul, to ask, to plead somehow, to like represent struggle in order to, I don't know, see some shift, see some change in the white being around the sort of, around segregation and, not around genocide, the genocide of the black people. What this ends up sort of doing though is creating this yet another. So the planners do the unseen thing. It ends up visualizing and making sonic struggle, and then also allowing that space to be multi-participatory. Everywhere I've gone in the world, no one's not known who Aretha Franklin is, but a lot of places they don't know who the Black Panthers are. So like, if you think about that as a legacy of the sorrow songs, the Jubilee Fisk Singers were a group organized by, oh God, wow. I'm totally blanking on the name of the college, but it'll come to me in a second. In the South, and they toured Europe. They toured all over Europe, saw Queen Victoria, played for her. You know, she was like, wherever they're from, they know how to sing. Like, so again, this sort of like participation in the aesthetic of black struggle and the sound of blackness and the sound of slavery, in the spectacle of slavery. I mean, also this sort of like, there's a really great Vincent Woodard book called The Delectable Negro. So all the conflations around, fetishistic conflations around the black body and actual tradable goods, coffee, honey, sugar, chocolate. Keep going, you know, they become these things, these sorrow songs, like in a way, extremely like the Planners Movement in terms of the dissonance in sort of like production and execution, content and meaning. These songs of sorrow also do a strange thing where they covertly sort of like mask a lot of, I mean, so we go from sorrow songs into the blues, right? You go to the libraryofcongress.org where a lot of field recordings are captured. You type in blind, ... You'll get a list of over 1,600 probably blind Willies, blind Johnsons, blind ... Do you think all these guys were blind? You think all of them were really blind? No. But they knew that white people were like, oh, a blind Negro must be sagacious, you know? So there's like a lot of playing around within blackness of this. I mean, we talked about Fred Moten, which I'll come to in a second also. But this like, this sort of doubling then, this like in between and around and inside of the struggle and using the struggle also as a means of extracting capital is not lost on the freedmen and is not lost on the early black performer at all. You know, this is like the idea of the minstrel is really like a dualist, maybe a multiplicited sort of trickster character. So then what it actually happens with this kind of like, with this crazy apartheid that the planners movement starts, with all its unseen, culturally enforced laws and all of its colorblind, democratic statements, grandeur, so too then does black aesthetics follow with grand statements of suffering that are actually made by black bodies that are probably more in proximity to white systems of capture and means of production than they are embedded in their communities. Does that make sense? So yeah, so there's like this kind of like, and this we can see even, you know, Kanye, like, drop the mic, you know what I mean? Like, so we can see this stuff now happening still, this sort of like Mammy, Jezebel, Sapphire, King Kong, the black male rapist, all these sort of visualizations of black struggle, aesthetics of black cultural representation that are portrayed by largely interracial actors that are gaining people access to comfortable like lives that are like very far removed from the carceral state, while also turning bodies that are black bodies that are unrepresented, that are incarcerated, that are undereducated into a sort of raw material for the ecstatic experience. And Black Twitter, again, Xenon Black Twitter, the stakes of refusing social media, the stakes of engaging with social media. Faucets is a school to prison pipeline zine, so all issues around like the school to prison pipeline, the persecution of young black males in urban centers. And we actually use the funds from that text, that's a really expensive text, and we use the funds from that text to be able to circulate articles informally to people who are incarcerated. Okay, distribution, extraction. The Underground Museum, we're really happy to be in like spaces that are really messy, like the Underground Museum, which was started by my friend Noah Davis, and within his library, it's, I mean, it's what it sounds like. It's not really a museum, it's a museum now. Noah died recently, and yeah, RIP, but his legacy lives on, so there's a few other spaces that are sort of like in LA, like using this Noah Davis model. To start new bookstores, to start places where programming and non-othering happens, you know, like a kind of not diverse space, but a space of not being othered. We're also happily existing in some jail archives. We try to do a lot of writers' workshops and groups, especially black-focused groups. Just worked with Justice Singleton on a writers' group in LA. Empowering sort of new spaces that especially are doing like new infrastructure or trying to do like collective infrastructure like Naval LA, F Magazine, and sort of like starting nonprofit umbrella groups that can house other programs. And also book production, theft, and bootlegging. But then also sort of selling at very high cost these Xeroxes to the MoMA, New Museum, Whitney Museum, New York Public Library, university libraries all around. It's really, I mean, it's fun, you know? It's like, it's great to get an order from the University of Dartmouth and be like, yeah, 12 readers will be $700. Anyway, it's kind of an inflation, but it's fun. Places like Red Emma's Communist Bookstore, where all the people who work there are predominantly black, a lot of trans, people are like of color, a beautiful space basically who all own this collective bookstore. It's communist, it's been a staple of Baltimore for a long time. We've done projects in the free school there. Murmur's Bookstore is a new museum space starting now too. I say museum in bunny ears because who knows what it'll actually be. Solano Archives is another space that's, yeah, been really great. And I was also using this sort of like Noah Davis museum hustle model. And yeah, last thing. Okay, last thing is the solution. So I've heard a lot of people being like, Robin Hood's not cool, or like whatever, we're gonna not, kind of. But in terms of the title of the talk, like what we owe future generations, I think we owe them a bit of Robin Hooding. I think we owe them not just Robin Hooding, but a bit more of like, again, with the white sort of neoliberal virtue signaling of reclaiming new family structures or new kinship structures, or promoting ideas of hashtag friendship. Actually, what about like reworking ideas of patricide and matricide back into these back into cultural inheritances, redistributing wealth drastically through cultural inheritances, giving back of land that you know, come into through like these sort of weird mechanisms of structural white supremacy. And then speaking simply about colonialism and white supremacy from an affective base as a white body and as a white being. I think we all owe future generations the sort of dropping of the act, you know, a lessening of this dissonance. And we owe like a future generation, we owe them a white being that has been shattered. So we all need to get busy shattering that internal architecture of white sort of supremacy. So yeah, in that recognition of like kind of like the racist assumption of primitive accumulation, I think Robin Hooding is cool and patricide is even cooler. And I think we owe that to the future. This is also going to be the last or another iteration of a project called Alexandria. So when we get back from the break, I'll pass my card around and I just ask you guys to all send me a PDF of what you're currently reading. Thank you.